their op-ed board came out with an op-ed titled "Hamas was right under UNRWA's nose. The United Nations agency looked the other way, keeping Gaza safe for Hamas." And that's why we have Hillel Neuer with us today. Hillel, welcome. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Gabe, it's great to be on your show, and you have been doing tremendous work, and it's great to join you on this podcast.
Thanks, Hillel. So let's first start with, why this is important to an American audience. It's very hard in America to understand the relevance of the UN. Most Americans all over this country can't understand why the United Nations General Assembly is in New York, why the United States pays so much into the United Nations, what's happening at the United Nations, or what's the relevance of it. I just looked up some numbers, then I'm going to turn it over to you. There's 193 member states of the United Nations. The United States, though, pays more than a third of the UN's budget. It's $18.1 billion in 2022. About $3 billion of that just goes to their General Operations Fund. And UNRWA, which we'll be talking about a lot today, the United States pays almost $500 million into UNRWA, more than any other country in the world. Why don't we start with that? Why is this relevant for Americans? What's America's role in the United Nations, and how have you seen that change over the years?
Well, the UN is indeed a massive organization, as you said, billions of dollars, and the US is the leading contributor. In some cases, it can promote US interests. There are times when America does want to get involved when there's a humanitarian crisis happening for Syrian refugees or some other world crisis, and it's in America's interest to resolve that problem. And sometimes the UN humanitarian agency is the vehicle. The problem is that many UN bodies are hijacked by dictatorships. Certainly the Human Rights Council, which is my specialty because it's based in my hometown of Geneva, Switzerland, that is 60% dictatorships. China, Qatar, Cuba, in the past, Venezuela was on it. So some of the worst regimes of the world seek and obtain membership on this body. Other bodies like the General Assembly, which is the parliament of the UN, has also made up of many dictatorships. North Korea sits there, so does Iran, so does Syria. And the result is that you can often get the complete opposite of human rights, the complete opposite of peace, the complete opposite of international security. And you'll have dictatorships and often Western apologists. The dictatorships love to appoint a professor from London or Rome or even America, who hates Israel, who hates capitalism, and will do it as a Western expert appointed by a UN body. So you do have this toxic alliance between dictatorships that hate the West and radical ideologues in America, in Europe, who also hate the West and will get appointed. So we might think, well, a pox on both your houses, let's just abandon that place. It's not going to happen. The UN is there. It's not going away, even under George W. Bush, even under Trump. You can't pull out of it. It's there. It's one of these things where America is at the table. It affects our world. It ends up influencing what happens on our shores. Ideas that come out of the UN will influence universities, judges, media, students. So we need to be active. Doesn't mean you have to be at every UN body all the time. But America, in my opinion, needs to have its voice heard and needs to push back against those who would subvert the language and idea of human rights. Words and ideas today are global, and we may think that we can sort of hide in our shells and it won't affect us, but they permeate. They affect us. And I believe that we need to push back. It's important to push back against the way our tax money is being misused and the way our ideas of basic justice, of democracy, decency are being subverted.
Well, but the U.S. obviously has an oversized budget, impact on the budget. Does it have an oversized influence on what happens at the United Nations? It seems like it used to in a way, but these days it doesn't seem to be the case. What do you see?
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, I've been at this job. Next month will be my 20th anniversary. And that means I arrived in 2004 and now it's 2024. And America is not in the same place it was. When I arrived, the U.S., this was the administration of George W. Bush. I remember the U.S. ambassador at the time that he represented, he was a former U.S. Marine. He represented a superpower. And you felt it, that the U.S. was a superpower, the superpower in the room in 2004. And fast forward 20 years later, America is tired. America's fought the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, and there is a sense that America doesn't have the fight in it anymore. There's a sense that country like China in the past 20 years has become incredibly influential. Other countries have risen, and America has diminished, and America's self-confidence is lacking. So there is a sense that I do think that America can have influence on various bodies, certainly where it's the top contributor. If they pick up the phone and say, look, Secretary General Guterres, I mean, Nikki Haley, around 2017, around March of 2017, the UN had published a report attacking Israel for accusing it of apartheid. And Nikki Haley picked up the phone and she said, I think it was Guterres, the Secretary General. She said, look, this is absurd, and you got to do something about it. And he got this UN agency in Beirut, Lebanon, to delete the report from its website. She picked up the phone, she made it happen. And my concern is that too often, the current administration, it seems like they're oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes they're champions more of the UN than they are of the US.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. And just to break that apart a little bit, and then we'll get into what's happening in Gaza. You know, on the Republican side today here in the United States, I know you're not American, you're a Canadian citizen, lives in Europe. But here on the Republican side, we have, like, you know, it's a Haley-Trump face-off. Trump is leading by all polls by astronomical numbers. But it's interesting when you're talking about that era. Nikki Haley was ambassador to the United Nations under Donald Trump. So
they were afraid of Trump. I mean, certainly at the beginning, not at the end, but at the beginning, they were scared. So when she called on the phone, that was really the first 2 months of the administration. They were quite scared.
Yeah, and what's come out over the years of the relationship between Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, at least when they worked together, not on the campaign trail now against each other, but where they were in constant communication and they spoke directly about what was happening at the United Nations, and that obviously had a big impact. Although we're not seeing that today from the United States. We see there's really a coalition on the other side, the coalition of all the Arab states that are there, China, Iran, unabashedly creating this environment that's impacting our lives here in America, impacting the way the world is being shaped. But what worries me is I don't see the same sort of coalition being built for the West, led by the United States. Remember when Joe Biden became president, he said in one of his first meetings with international leaders, you know, America's back. And I'm not seeing that at all. Do you see that? Do you see the American coalition, the Western coalition at the United Nations seems to be far weaker than the coalition led by China and Iran? What do you see?
Yeah, I think that's true. The one caveat to that is it was impressive, in my opinion. Not everyone will agree, but in pushing back against Russia. I mean, Russia is in alliance with China and Iran, and they hate the West. They hate America. And Russia, under Putin, has always seen America as his greatest threat, even though America was zero threat against Russia and would have been happy to have a Russian economy that was flourishing and cooperating with the West. But, you know, the West, America and Europe, did mobilize in a strong way to push back against the Kremlin when it comes to Ukraine. And at the UN, I saw it. They voted numerous times against Russia. They kicked Russia off the Human Rights Council, things we had never seen before. So I did see extraordinary mobilization at the UN by the West, acting in concert in ways they have almost never done before. So that would be an exception. But otherwise, if you talk about Iran, if you talk about Venezuela, if you talk about other threats, certainly, you know, Hamas and things like that, the West, in my opinion, has been weak and has failed to join forces the way they should be doing so.
Yeah, from my perspective, the argument of whether the United States should defund the United Nations entirely, throw them out of New York, and really just disconnect from the United Nations, you know, the question is what happens next if we do that? Are we removing ourselves from the world stage here in the United States? From my perspective, either we're going to be a strong voice at the United Nations, a voice that leads the West and really is something that helps America around the world, our interests, which then in turn will help us here in our borders, or we don't do it at all. So there, you know, what have you thought about that? I mean, if it sounds from your comment earlier, you'd think if the U.S. pulls out, it would be a disaster. It's not going to happen. It's something that we have to live with. I'm not sure that's the case. If we have another Donald Trump presidency, I think the pressure on the UN is going to be tremendous.
Yeah, look, as I said, the U.S. is not pulling out of the UN. People can dream about it. It's not going to happen. There are numerous treaties that America is signatory to, and on the whole, America does want a world that has some regulations. We may not like the World Health Organization, but in principle, we want a WHO that works. The world should be collaborating and needs to collaborate on issues of world health, on issues of international telecommunications, intellectual property, world trade, labor regulations. There are many things. These are agencies based in Geneva. There are many things we don't pay attention to where the world has to be in communication and in some kind of cooperation. It's often dysfunctional, but it's in America's interest to make it work the best that it can. So in my opinion, it's not realistic to talk about it. And, we can talk about pulling out of a given agency like the Human Rights Council when it's upside down. But the reality is the UN is not going away. And America needs to show leadership. It needs to pull the Europeans all on board and to help, pull their weight and push back. Certainly the dictatorships, China, Russia, Iran, are very active at the UN. Cuba is very active at the UN. People may not know it. They introduced like half the resolutions at the Human Rights Council, which in some way or another are subversive against human rights, against the West. And they're very clever because they do understand that these things have global influence. You may not even feel it, but our universities are affected, our media is affected, our students are affected, our diplomats are affected, our judges are affected. Global trends don't stop at the border. There's the internet, there's books, there's magazines. It like it or not, the things that are said and done at the UN do affect our society. So we need to be present and push back. And I keep pushing the Americans, whatever administration, to fight back.
What about the UN Human Rights Council? You mentioned it. That's where you spend most of your time. That's an agency that has been overrun by, more than anyone probably on the planet, by terrorist countries, by communist regimes, by dictatorships. Is there a manner for the U.S. to put a sufficient pressure on the United Nations to save and reform the UN Human Rights Council, or is that something that you think really doesn't see if there's no real future for it?
Well, look, it doesn't look like it's going away. It was created in 1946 by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a great humanitarian. She was the founding chair of the UN Human Rights Commission. In the early years, there were eminent figures. And as you said, it got hijacked. By 2003, the chair was the Libyan regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. So talk about the rise and fall. Eleanor Roosevelt, 1946, 2003, Colonel Gaddafi. So it got subverted, and it's not going away. In my opinion, America should push back. I'd like America to be present. In my opinion, we've had a paradoxical situation. The Republicans said we're pulling out. It didn't go away. It caused a lot of damage, attacking Israel, empowering communist and terrorist regimes, as you said. And when America does engage under the Democrats, too often, they will become cheerleaders for the Human Rights Council and say they're doing great work. I want someone like Ambassador Patrick Moynihan. He represented I guess it was Ford. It was 1975, so I guess it was already President Ford. And it was Moynihan was famously stood up for America in extraordinary ways. And even though in some cases he lost the vote when they declared Zionism a form of racism, his speech is one of the greatest speeches ever delivered at the United Nations, and it went down in history. So we may go down numerically, but morally we can lead. And I do believe that America's voice should be heard and can be heard. So I'm looking for the Moynihans to step up to fight back, and that's in my opinion that has the most impact.
So I haven't heard that speech, so I'll look it up. But the most impactful speech I've seen at the Human Rights Council is actually yours in your most viral clip ever, which was your "Where Are Your Jews" clip, when Israel was being accused by speaker after speaker of apartheid. And I'm not sure if it was planned or wasn't planned, but with great passion, you went through Arab nation by Arab nation. You said, Algeria, you used to have 175,000 Jews. Today you have 0. Where are your Jews, Algeria? Iraq, you used to have 150,000 Jews or whatever the number was. Today you have 0. Where are your Jews, Iraq? Where is the apartheid, Mr. Chairman or Mr. President? That was a moment where truth just was thunderous in that room. And in fact, it was silence after you spoke, which isn't usually what happens, because no one could argue with that. Right? I mean, the Jews were driven out of all the Arab lands in the 40s and 50s, and no one really talks about it. It was almost 1 million Jews that were driven out. And that's really, we're talking about different rules for different people and what they call apartheid. That's something where you called out the truth, and it's something that's not really heard in that room. But let's talk a little bit about UNRWA and why you've really been making...
It ties in directly, Gabe, because, from something like 800,000 to 1 million Jews were pushed out of Arab lands and Iran after 1948, when Israel was created. And there are no Jewish refugees in the world today. They've either been resettled in Israel. In Israel, there's no such thing as an Iraqi refugee, an Algerian refugee. They've either been resettled in Israel or in America or in France or other countries. There are no Jewish refugees. And the Arab refugees could have been resettled 75 years ago, but the Arab states, with complicity with the Palestinians, decided to instead to perpetuate grievance, resentment, and war. And that brings us to UNRWA.
Yeah, so tell us about UNRWA, because as far as I understand, the term refugee for the United Nations and every other definition of refugee isn't something assignable to the next generation. It's something you can carry with you if you're thrown out of a country, which is even disputable here, who was thrown out, who wasn't thrown out. But if you're thrown out of a country, you could be a refugee, have refugee status, be protected in some way, or at least provided some resources by other UN agencies. But the Palestinians have some special designation where today, it's people's great grandchildren, where their grandparents were alive in 1948. They called it. They just said that they were put into refugee status, and now they could be living anywhere in the world, and they are still considered refugees, and they get resources from the United Nations. So, can you first talk about that? Let's lay the groundwork a little bit of how we got to where we got to today, which is UNRWA participating in the October 7th attacks.
Yeah. Look, well, as you said, in Geneva, where I'm based, there's the UN Refugee Agency, known as UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees. And their mandate is very simple, is to help refugees and to resettle them. If they can't repatriate them back in the country where they came from, if the war is over, the persecution that they fled has ended, they go back, that's repatriation, or they're resettled. Like 1 million Syrian refugees went to Germany, hundreds of thousands have gone to Sweden, and so forth. America takes in refugees, has always taken in refugees. That's what UNHCR does. You start out as a refugee, and their job is to make you not a refugee. My great-grandfather escaped Russian persecution, religious persecution in Russia in 1904, and received Canadian citizenship, and we've been Canadians for over a century. I'm not a Russian refugee. On the contrary, by contrast, UNRWA has the complete opposite approach. So it was initially created, UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency, was created to help Palestinian refugees after the war of 1948, where 5 Arab nations attacked Israel, invaded. The UN had voted for a Jewish and Arab state. The Jews cheered. They literally danced on the streets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, even though they were offered a truncated state that disconnected from their ancient ancestral biblical lands in Judea and Samaria. They did not have access to Temple Mount and the Western Wall, or Hebron, where King David lived, and they didn't have access to their biblical holy sites, but they were given something, and the notion of having to be independent and have a state, that was everything. So they said yes. The Arabs said no and went to war. They lost the war. They had refugees who fled the area, or in some battles they may have been pushed out. There were refugees. And the simple thing, they went to Lebanon, they went to neighboring Syria, Jordan, Egypt, or Gaza Strip, and they should have been resettled, and that was the normal thing. They were, it would almost be like a Canadian going to America. We're culturally different. We're not the same thing, but it's quite close. Religiously, if you're a Christian from Canada going to Vermont, you're very close. Okay, you can be resettled. So when an Arab went from Haifa to Lebanon, it's the same religion, the same language, the same culture. They went a few dozens of miles north. They could easily have been resettled, but both the Palestinian Arabs and the Arab states chose otherwise. They said, we'll not resettle them. If we resettle them, the war is over, and we accept a Jewish state in our midst. And the Arabs said, this we cannot do. We cannot say the war is over. So they said, we're going to not resettle them. We're going to keep them as permanent refugees until they get to go back and dismantle Israel. And for reasons that I cannot explain, the Western states went along with this and have been funding UNRWA. Again, the early years, the idea was benign, was to help them, and for a few years, and they'd be resettled. But the Arab states said no. So in Lebanon, for 75 years, those of Palestinian descent are not allowed to work and be a lawyer or a doctor in Lebanon. They basically is an apartheid system there. They have to remain non-citizens, stateless Palestinians, who they're told are one day going to go back to their homes in Israel. In other words, that sovereign Israel is going to have to admit hostile, October 7th type people into their midst and to dismantle Israel. Jordan actually gave citizenship to 2 million Palestinians. So they are citizens, and according to UNRWA, they're refugees. A citizen refugee exists nowhere else in the world. Again, nowhere else in the world, only under UNRWA rules. Gaza. Gaza is what Palestinians call Palestine. So how can you be a Palestinian refugee living in Palestine? Legally absurd. And same thing with the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. According to the UN, it's Palestine. So how could you be living in Jenin and be a Palestinian refugee? They're doing it because they want Palestinians to be a political pawn in the agenda to dismantle Israel. And that is why I say that the terrorism that we exposed, thousands of teachers on a Telegram chat group celebrating the acts of October 7th, Israel revealed 12 UNRWA staff took part in the massacre, mass rape, mutilation, torture of October 7th. And Wall Street Journal reported that 1,200 UNRWA staff in Gaza are operatives of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Terrorism is infested. UNRWA is infested with terrorism. But, and with this I conclude, the notion that UNRWA is infested with terrorism is not a bug, it's a feature. Because the whole point of UNRWA is to tell Palestinians, you're going to one day dismantle Israel and replace Israel. And that was the message they got over decades. And that is why there's a direct line between the narrative and raison d'etre, the very reason of existence of UNRWA, and the massacre of October 7th.
Yeah, absolutely. And the part I think that you left out was that the neighboring countries want nothing to do with the Palestinians. They don't want to absorb them either, not just to continue to perpetuate the lie that Israel is going to at some point cease to exist and these Palestinians are going to go back, quote unquote, go back and make Israel into a state called Palestine, but also because they don't want these Palestinians there. We have Brigitte Gabriel coming on in a few weeks who talks about it so passionately. She's a Lebanese Christian and talks about the massacre that Palestinians in Lebanon took upon the Christian community there, or brought upon the Christian community there many years ago. Same thing happened, as you know, in all the neighboring areas. They don't want them there at all. They want to continue to perpetuate this lie. But the part that's so hard for me to understand, and maybe you have some insight on it, Hillel, is why the West goes along with this lie, why the West goes along with this charade. It's not just intellectual. The United States is putting billions and billions of dollars, 18 billion this last year, and more over the years. We're putting money towards this, towards the UN. It was, just to be clear, 18 billion was towards the UN in general, 500 billion, just under 500 billion was towards UNRWA specifically. But people are putting money behind these lies in the West. Why do you think that is? Even now, we see all these countries are defunding UNRWA. I heard you give an interview this week where you explained it's not really where anyone's defunding UNRWA. It's a little bit of political theater. People, countries sent UNRWA some money and then said they're not sending them anymore, and they'll send them more later. They've done this before. So why is it that you think the West goes along with this charade?
Well, you know, I learned a bit of psychology by listening to Dr. Jordan Peterson, and one of the things that he said is that if you're looking at motives for an action, we can look at the outcome, and then maybe we can infer the motive. If the outcome of UNRWA is the dismantling of Israel and a sort of permanent declaration of war against Israel, maybe that's the motive. You know, I have to ask all the Western countries, why are you funding an agency? And it's not today, it's been for, again, as I said, the early years, the purpose of UNRWA was benign. It was actually as a temporary help for people who had fled their homes. But over the years, when it became very clear, and I say very clear because the spokespersons for UNRWA are viciously anti-Israel. It's an agency, by the way. Some people think it's aid workers. This isn't 30,000 Swedish aid workers. It's 99.9% Palestinian Arabs who are virulently anti-Semitic. Go on their Facebook pages. We do. UNWatch.org. We have a section on UNRWA, where, as you said in my speech in Congress, for 10 years, you and I talked about it before, for 10 years, we sent warnings to UNRWA that their teachers were encouraging and promoting terrorism, massacres by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, glorifying Adolf Hitler, the Nazi dictator. This is regular incitement by UNRWA teachers. We said we estimate thousands of your UNRWA teachers are supporting and promoting terrorism, and their response was to attack us.
And it's
So
not just on their social media pages, right? In the textbooks themselves, in the lessons that they're teaching the students themselves that are paid for by the United Nations, which means in turn it's paid for a third by the United States and by the rest of the world.
That is correct. The United States in the past 3 years, according to the administration, estimated they gave $1 billion, nearly $1 billion, to UNRWA in the past 3 years alone. So I have to ask the Western states. They're not naive. They know everything that's going on. They know that the UNRWA spokesman is attacking me from the beginning for putting this stuff out. His name is Chris Gunnis. He was a spokesman until a few years ago. Now he's come back as a surrogate. And 2 days ago, he said, don't listen to UN Watch. They're a puppet for Israel and the IDF, which is false.
Oh, it's incredible. Just interject on that is you put out testimony to the U.S. Congress with a report backed up by left-wing media, by the way. The left-wing media, New York Times put out a report that supports what you're saying. The Wall Street Journal put out a report that's more centrist, let's say. But the media as a whole, you can't really, this is objective facts that you're putting out there. And I'm pretty sure the Secretary of State said your testimony was very, very persuasive or something of that.
He said it about the intelligence. It wasn't ours, but the intelligence reports about the UNRWA staff being involved in terrorism. He said highly, highly credible. And no one.
The UN didn't respond to any of the substance. Was my only point. They just went and attacked you, and they said, "Wait, UN Watch, we've seen them before. Don't trust them." But they didn't respond to any of these actual allegations.
Yeah, look, we sent them names, screenshots. We're sending them screenshots of their own staff, pictures of their staff in the UNRWA schools, which they post on Facebook. And in the latest edition of our report was the UNRWA's Terrorgram. This is the Telegram chat group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers. We had access to their UNRWA contract ID. So all the information is there, and they're putting their head in the sand. It's absurd. The latest revelation was that on Saturday was that under UNRWA headquarters in Gaza was a Hamas terror tunnel that was hiding their computer intelligence data center with servers, a whole server farm, where the electric cables were coming directly from the UNRWA electric grid, were coming into the terror tunnel and powering the Hamas servers. So this is under UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, is a key asset for the Hamas terrorist group. Couldn't get more damning than that. And the UNRWA chief, his response was to say, UNRWA does not know what's under its headquarters in Gaza. We don't know what's under our noses. It's unbelievable. This is his quote. UNRWA does not know what's under its headquarters in Gaza. It's nonsense. To excavate a major terror tunnel under the headquarters involved, months, if not years of work. The power cables were coming from UNRWA. Someone must have seen their electricity bill, double in from 1 month to the next. Completely absurd. The New York Times, I think it was Wall Street Journal, reported last week that about 10 years ago, the UNRWA noticed in their parking lot that the parking lot was sinking. And no one decided not to ask any questions. Meaning everyone knew that all of Gaza was excavated with tunnels. When they build a subway system in your town, you know it. I've had it in Geneva. I've seen it in Tel Aviv. But anyone who's seen a subway system being built, it's a massive excavation, and it's huge amounts of noise and dust. And this was the #1 labor project in Gaza. Everybody knew they were building hundreds of terror tunnels, but UNRWA, closed their eyes, as Sergeant Schultz used to say in Hogan's Heroes, something I watched in the early 70s. The Sergeant Schultz would say, "I see nothing, I hear nothing." They chose not to see, they chose not to hear. But as I said in Congress, the UN cannot say they did not know. They knew. We warned them from 2015, 2017, 2019, 2021, November 2023, March 2023, January 2024. The UN knew. They cannot say they didn't know.
Yeah, I was talking to Justin and Teal, the producers here, before we went live, and I wish I could show the images. Maybe we'll put them up after. But the wires, the cables in the middle of the data room of the UNRWA center, were going straight down, visibly straight down underground. Like a big circle, you would see a hole in the ground with tons of cables going down for data and electricity. They knew it was there. There was a full facility under the United Nations facility. And like you said, in 2014, 15, their own parking lot started sinking, and everybody knew why, and they didn't say anything. But it's also important to understand, because you mentioned it, but it's 250 miles worth of tunnels right now under Gaza. And when people see Israel destroying people's homes and buildings, it's to get to this terror infrastructure that's underneath them. If you don't want your home destroyed, you shouldn't build a tunnel underneath it with, by the way, doors into that tunnel from all those houses that are being destroyed. And yes, all of them, and from schools and from hospitals. But we live in this crazy time, Hillel, when we can show people pictures, we can show people videos, we can testify before Congress, and they still don't believe it, and they still don't want to believe it. And I think that ties a lot very well, not nicely, because it's the opposite of nicely, but ties very well to why the West continues to fund UNRWA and continues to fund the lie of the Palestinian refugee system and perpetuate that lie that just creates more war. And all the conspiracy theorists on, sort of this is just going to perpetuate war and the military-industrial complex, all these things, it kind of feeds that narrative. I'm not one of those people. I don't really live in the conspiracy theory land, but you have to really ask some serious questions. And I think it's time after October 7th, just like it was a time after 9/11 here in the United States, that we have to start telling truths. And we have to look at things with clear eyes and say what they are. If we want to fund the United Nations Human Rights Council, we should say that it's a cesspool and it's rotten to the core, but the only way we're going to fix it is if we're there. We shouldn't be lauding them while we're there. We shouldn't be perpetuating that lie. And people talk about who if we were to dissolve UNRWA, and that's something that you have advocated for. It's on your website. You spoke about it all over the news. People always ask you the same follow-up question, which is, well, then who else is gonna give the aid to the Palestinians that need aid in there? Israel has proposed themselves. Smotrich at least has from the right party, but I actually think he's correct here as well, which is Israel could do it, the IDF could do it. There's also other agencies. But the more difficult follow-up question there is, the vast majority of people in Gaza, it's not a pretty thing to say, are supportive of Hamas. They were democratically elected. There's polls, even in the West Bank, which I hate using that term, but in cities controlled by the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, over 85% of them support what happened on October 7th. So if anything that requires human capital, people to go out and hand out food and do anything, pass around cement, do whatever that they need to help rebuild Gaza or help the lives of the people in Gaza, the civilians that are in Gaza, you're necessarily going to need people from Gaza. And necessarily those people have been educated at UNRWA schools and have been indoctrinated by Hamas and a culture of hate and of murder. So how is it that we can actually, is there a way that the world can actually give aid and channel aid directly to Palestinian people who do need some food today and need some help in getting back on their feet after this war without empowering Hamas and those who support Hamas?
Look, I think you've identified priorities that are short-term and long-term. So there's a war going on right now, and it's essential that we do everything to make sure that Palestinians in Gaza have their humanitarian needs taken care of, as we have to be mindful of the Israeli hostages that have been kept for nearly half a year and have not received medication and may be tortured in horrible ways by Hamas. Some of them may have been executed by Hamas. We mustn't forget the humanitarian need that the hostages need to be released immediately. But talking about the Palestinians in Gaza, we want to make sure the humanitarian needs are kept, but without empowering and funding an agency that is infested with terrorism, as has been exposed like never before due to data that's come into possession of Israel and that's reached the major news networks. So, as you said, Gaza is a great challenge. You said that the society there has been poisoned with a genocidal, nihilistic terrorist organization, which was elected by their majority, and many people in Gaza support Hamas. So this is a major problem. One of the congressmen, when I spoke, is his name Darrell Issa. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, from California. He's of Arab descent. He's a Republican. He said, America should treat Gaza the way that they treated Germany and Japan after World War II. He didn't use this term, but he basically spoke about denazification. If you have an entire population that is hypnotized with a death cult, you have to denazify the territory. And ultimately, that's the only hope for Gaza, is that they become not like Arabs like Hamas, but Arabs like the Emirates. The Emirates are entirely focused on the future, on developing their society, making peace with Israel, and it's one of the most flourishing parts of the world is Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. Well, Gaza can be the same. Gaza has beautiful beaches. I've been there years ago. I've seen them. You can turn Gaza into Tel Aviv 2.0. You can turn it into Nice, the French Riviera. It has beautiful sunshine. And they have resources. They build hundreds of miles of terror tunnels. So they're industrious. Change that. Build upwards, build towers like they have in Dubai. Don't build hundreds of miles of terror tunnels. So ultimately, that's what we need. But in the short term, we need humanitarian aid. In the long term, I think it shouldn't be, you don't need the UN. Let Palestinians have their own schools, and they can do it. But in the short term, what we're advising is other agencies. It could be the World Food Program, could be UNICEF, and could be UN Development Program. There are a whole alphabet of UN agencies or other non-governmental organizations that know very well how to show up in the middle of nowhere in Sudan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and deliver aid to millions of people who need it. So guess what? The line that UNRWA is irreplaceable, only UNRWA can give out food aid. Nonsense. Many others can replace it. But how you achieve a future in Gaza beyond UNRWA is something we need to address. That is why we have announced the first international summit on a future beyond UNRWA, future for Gaza beyond UNRWA. And we've invited humanitarian aid experts, members of parliament from around the world, former Middle East peace envoys. This will take place in Geneva on February 26th, at the same time as the UN gathers for its annual session at the Human Rights Council. Antonio Guterres will be there, foreign ministers from around the world will be there, and we will be there holding our summit on how to replace UNRWA. And people can watch it live at unwatch.org. It'll be on Monday, February 26th. More details will be coming out.
Amazing. You said earlier that people can dream that the U.S. can pull out of the United Nations. It's never going to happen. People can also dream that Gaza could turn into Dubai and build upwards and have a beautiful, forward-thinking society. It's also never going to happen because education matters, indoctrination matters, and it's at the end of the day a religious war. I think we could talk forever, so we're not going to go forever, but I do want to give you a chance to comment on your tweet this morning. I pulled it up here. This morning, you called out the UN Human Rights Council, saying that 2 years ago, this month, I urged the UN Human Rights Council not to appoint the anti-Semite Francesca Albanese as one of their, quote, experts. We submitted the dossier below. The UN went ahead and appointed her. So no one should be surprised that she's now justifying the Hamas massacre. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Francesca Albanese, and we'll wrap on that point.
Good. Well, look, about 2 days ago or so, this UN so-called human rights expert, she's the special rapporteur on Palestine for the Human Rights Council. It's a permanent mandate to investigate, quote, Israel's violations. Part of her mandate is not to look at the Palestinian crimes by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or Fatah. So the mandate itself is prejudicial and it presumes Israeli guilt, and it only looks at Israel. So that's the mandate. But what about the person? There have been some persons who were a little less pernicious, not Albanese. She was appointed 2 years ago. Indeed, as you said, February 2022. I went to the council and I said, this is a woman who routinely compares Israelis to Nazis. This is a woman whose husband worked for the PLO, didn't disclose it in her application form when they asked about conflict of interest. It's a woman who has routinely, this is years ago, accused Israel of apartheid and genocide. And she's supposed to, according to the UN's own rules, be impartial and objective and non-selective. And she's anything but. Even in an interview, she said, I'm not sure if I'm going to take this or that job because I'm not objective on the issue, because she's a passionate anti-Israel advocate. By the way, she used to be a lawyer who worked for, drumroll please, UNRWA, right? So not surprisingly that the anti-Semites like Chris Gunnis and Francesca Albanese are drawn to UNRWA. There's a reason for that. So 2 days ago, she criticized the French government. The French president had said that October 7th was the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust. He was right. She said, no, that October 7th wasn't anti-Semitic. It was a response to Israeli oppression. The Hamas, terrorists who were doing mass murder of 1,200 Israelis, kidnapping civilians, killing kids at a music festival, torturing, killing babies, and all the other horrific things that happened. That was a response to Israeli oppression. And she told a Hamas conference a year ago or so that you have the right to resist. So this is someone who has egged on Hamas, told them they have the right to resist, defends UNRWA, said that Jews, she said in 2014, she said, donate to UNRWA. Here's the link. She said, donate to UNRWA. And you know that America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. Europe is subjugated by Holocaust guilt. She was condemned for anti-Semitism by Deborah Lipstadt. That's the Democrat administration's special envoy on anti-Semitism, who never once before condemned a UN expert for anti-Semitism. So we're talking about someone who has really reached a certain bar of anti-Semitism to get condemned by people. Never got condemned.
And she was appointed as an expert on what? What was her job?
She's the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine to investigate Israel's violations.
Wow.
And again, we warned the UN. No one spoke out at the time. Neither the US nor France nor Germany didn't speak out. Now I'm grateful that those three countries did condemn her, but it's a bit too little and too late. They should have spoken out before her appointment 2 years ago.
When you sent them all the information about who she was, they probably responded, "Yeah, we know. That's why we hired her."
That is why the council hired her.
What have you heard about Israel and Israel throwing out UNRWA from any Israeli-owned lands? Have you heard that this last week? I've been hearing some news about that.
Look, some things are said are strong statements that are made for political consumption domestically in Israel, and we'll have to see if Israel follows through. It's not a secret that historically the Israel Defense Establishment actually said, you know what, we don't like UNRWA, but it gives us quiet. That blew up in their faces on October 7th. Any agency that is teaching Palestinians for generations to end Israel and to encourage terrorism is not a good thing. It may buy you temporary quiet, but I think the Israeli Defense Establishment realized that UNRWA is, as the Swiss foreign minister realized in 2018, UNRWA is part of the problem, not part of the solution. We are sustaining the conflict, he said. Ignacio Cassis, Swiss foreign minister, he said it is a perverse logic. And that's what I said in Congress. It's a perverse logic to keep supporting UNRWA.
Yeah, I think a lot of the United Nations is a perverse logic. With that, Hillel Neuer, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Hopefully we'll do this in person sometime soon when we're in the same place. Thank you everyone for listening. We had a lot of comments, which I can't wait to check out after the show. Be sure to like and subscribe. We're on all these platforms. Make sure to support on Rumble. And also remember to stand for something. That's what this whole show is about, Standpoint. It's not just about having a viewpoint on something. It needs to be rooted in your beliefs and who you are. And no one that I know does that more than Hillel Neuer. So Hillel, thank you so much.
I'll do one plug before I forget. Thank
Go
you,
for
Gabe. Our organization is a nonprofit, unwatch.org. Sign up, subscribe. You can find out how you can join our campaign to fight evil and defend morality, decency, and democracy at the UN.
Perfect. unwatch.org. Thank you so much, Hillel Neuer. And we'll be back live. We'll be back on Thursday with the Lieutenant Governor of Florida, Jeanette Nunez. So make sure to tune in.